Good morning, Ambassador Bolton, and thanks for your time. I want to focus this interview on democracies versus autocracies. So let's start with Ukraine. Do you think that, what do you think about the Russian President Vladimir Putin's decision to put his top general, Valery Gerasimov, in direct control of the war?
Well, I think it's a very significant development. I don't think people should view it simply as substituting one general for another, as I've seen some commentators say. I mean, the fact is that Gerasimov is and has been for some time basically the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of the Russian military. It's like the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of the United States. Mark Milley currently holds that job. This would be like the United States taking Mark Milley out of the most important, the highest ranking military job in the country and putting him in charge of the war in Ukraine. So I read this as a political signal by Putin that he is putting in charge somebody he handpicked to be chairman of the Russian military establishment and basically saying, we're going to get this done. I think it indicates no flexibility on Putin's part for negotiation. But I also think it raises the stakes for Putin. He is, as we say in poker, he's pushing all his chips toward the center of the table. And now there's no laying off responsibility for failure in Ukraine on anybody else. This is Putin's decision. This is his commander. This is a high stakes proposition for Putin, not just in the war in Ukraine, but politically in Russia as well.
And so how do you imagine the future for Russia and the future relationship between Russia and the West?
Well, I don't see after nearly a year into this unprovoked aggression that the West can have any kind of productive relationship with a Putin regime in control in the Kremlin. Now, I don't know what's going to replace the Putin regime, since there are no structures, there are no effective elections. There isn't even a Politburo of the Communist Party to make the change. It's a true authoritarian government. But I think for many, whether they're in the United States or in Europe, who think we're simply going to turn the page on this and go back to the way things were before February the 24th, I just don't see that happening.
Do you think that the war in Ukraine is a kind of a wake-up call for the West?
I think it should be. I mean, I think Putin said in 2005 in a speech to the State Duma that the breakup of the Soviet Union was the greatest geopolitical catastrophe in the 20th century. And he then went on and made other statements in later years, basically threatening to put the Russian Empire back together again, not the Soviet Union, but the Russian Empire. And I think his behavior in a number of different countries, invading Georgia in 2008, invading Ukraine for the first time in 2014, now this invasion in 2022, that's behavior consistent with him seeking the objective of recreating the empire. And I think we frankly didn't pay enough attention to what he had done in the past. Now we're paying a lot of attention, but unfortunately it's resulting in enormous loss of human life and destruction of property in Ukraine as a consequence.
And is the regime at stake, at risks, the Putin's regime?
I don't think Putin at this point is at risk of falling, but I think if the military situation doesn't improve, particularly after the placing Gerasimov in as commander in the field, then I think things could change. But it doesn't necessarily mean that an anti-war government would take control. I think the biggest critics of Putin in Russia today are not those who are against the war. They're people who are for the war but think that Putin is losing it.
I see. And talking about regimes, protests, and so on, I would like to move to Iran. Is the regime in Iran going to fall after and because of the protests?
I don't think we know the answer to that yet. The regime still holds the monopoly of force, basically through the regular army and the Revolutionary Guards. But I do think it's accurate to say that the Ayatollahs are under greater threat today than at any point since the 1979 Islamic Revolution that brought them to power. Remember, these demonstrations come on top of years of enormous economic discontent. A lot of demonstrations all around the country, not very well covered by the Western press, but which were brutally repressed by Tehran in 2019. Nonetheless, those demonstrations, that discontent has continued. Now, the most recent wave of protest, almost 4 months long now, on top of that, many people in the West characterize the demonstrations and the resistance as an argument about dress codes for women, but it's really much more serious than that. This is a direct challenge to the legitimacy of the regime of the Ayatollahs itself. It's a philosophical challenge, a religious challenge in a sense. And I think the fact that, at least from what we can see, that not only the women of Iran, but certainly among the younger men as well, the support for what they're trying to do is overwhelming. And I think that puts the regime in real jeopardy.
Do you think that the lack of a leadership in the protest, it could be a problem for the demonstrators?
Yeah, I mean, I think in the early days it was actually a plus, because it helped to show these demonstrations were spontaneous across the country. There was no central command here. This was people who are expressing how tired they are of the regime. And yet they said things that were very consistent. They weren't saying death to the United States or death to Israel anymore. They were saying death to Khamenei, the supreme leader. Now, that said, if you don't have coordination within Iran, among the resistance forces, and I think with the Iranian diaspora in Europe and the United States, it's very hard to know how this continues. The fact is that the regime does have a monopoly of force. They've repressed dissent in the past. They're repressing it now. They're executing people, imprisoning people. I don't think we fully know how many people have been killed or wounded or imprisoned. So they're not going to go easily. And I do think the outside world can supply communications equipment and other resources that would be very helpful to the resistance. But at some point, they themselves have to develop a leadership and a plan, so we can see how to get to the end of the regime. And that ought to be the objective. We're not going to have a chance at resolving the nuclear problem, resolving Iran's support for terrorism, or any of its threats in the Middle East until we get a new government in Tehran.
How should the West handle with the current situation in Iran?
Well, I think the United States was right to withdraw from the 2015 nuclear deal. I think it was a very bad deal that really provided Iran a path to nuclear weapons. It didn't inhibit their nuclear program. It facilitated it, especially by unfreezing tens of billions of dollars of assets and eliminating sanctions. So I think at this point, although Biden has tried for 2 years to make concessions to get back into the deal, I think at least for now, that's not going to happen. But I think it's important that Europe also understand it was never a good deal, and it's gotten to be a worse deal given Iran's conduct, including selling drones and potentially other weapons to Russia to use in Ukraine. So I think Europe, I hope Europe will come closer to the view in the United States that the problem with Iran is not the nuclear program. It's the support for terrorism. It's its malign activities with conventional military in Iraq and elsewhere around the Middle East. The regime is the problem, and it's the regime we've got to resolve. And I think the way you resolve it is by supporting the people trying to overthrow it.
How to support them?
Well, as I say, I think they probably need communications equipment. I think what we ought to be doing is talking to resistance leaders inside Iran and among the diaspora populations around the world, and asking them what they need. We're not. This is not a revolution we're going to create from the outside. It's, I think, pretty obvious. It's a revolution of the Iranian people, and they're the ones that are going to have to make the key strategic decisions. But in terms of resources, communications, as I say, those are some things that come to mind quickly. But the resistance itself may have some good ideas. So we need to be talking to them. We need to have a clear policy objective for the West. And as I say, I think it should be overthrowing the regime. I think it is the principal obstacle right now to peace and stability in the Middle East.
Okay. I would like to move to the South America after the recent events in Brazil. And what is the position, the situation of democracies in South America, even considering, for example, efforts aimed at destabilization by countries such as China, for example?
Right. Well, obviously the focus is on Brazil because the riots that we've just seen on television. A copy, sadly, I think, of what happened in the United States on January the 6th, 2021, which was one of the worst days in American history, not to be duplicated again, I hope, and shouldn't be duplicated in other countries. So this is, people can lose close elections. That's a fact. If there's evidence of fraud, evidence that somebody's trying to steal the election, presented in the appropriate places and get a hearing in court and see what happens. But if you lose the election, part of democracy is accepting that you've lost, and we shouldn't ever forget that. Now, notwithstanding the focus on Brazil, I think the threat in the Western Hemisphere as a whole is from governments and movements and countries from the left. I think in Venezuela, for example, sadly, the opposition has had to give up the Guaido alternative government. The people of Venezuela are suffering terribly under the Maduro regime, and yet we have not been able to help them. The influence of Cuba there, in Nicaragua and other places around the hemisphere remains. In Mexico, we're worried about the breakdown of civil society because of the drug cartels. And around Latin America, I think there are just a lot of concern. So this is something I think that we could go country by country, but it's a cyclical pattern in much of Latin America, and I think we missed a lot of opportunities over the past 5 or 10 years where we might have avoided some of this, but now it's in front of us, and we need to deal. I think the principal problem remains Venezuela. And I think if we could restore democratic government there, it would have an effect all through the hemisphere.
But after the failure of the Guaido experience, how to restore democracy in Venezuela?
Well, I would not have given up on Guaido or the concept of an alternative government, which many other governments around the world had recognized. What the Maduro regime wants is to get people into negotiation about new elections, which he will then try to steal. Now, people say, but we'll have international observers and so on. That's been tried in Venezuela before. This government is not going to give up voluntary power. And in fact, even in April of 2019, when the opposition went into the streets and tried to bring the military over, thought they had a plan to get a new government, it was Russian and Cuban troops that kept Maduro in Caracas. If he had fled to Cuba, which is what he wanted to do, it might have succeeded. So this external influence, particularly in Venezuela, from Russia aiding the Cubans, but China is very present as well for all kinds of reasons, including Venezuela's oil and gas reserves. It's a very dangerous situation, really a threat to democracy around the Western Hemisphere.
And I mentioned before China, so I would like to move to China and to the Indo-Pacific. What does the Biden-Kishida meeting represent for the future of the Indo-Pacific, the free and open Indo-Pacific, as the Prime Minister Kishida says?
Right. Well, this is a very significant meeting. It comes on the heels of Prime Minister Kishida announcing a doubling of Japan's defense budget over the next 5 years to bring it from 1% to 2% of gross domestic product, which is, of course, the NATO target. And given that it's a growing Japanese economy, hopefully in the next 5 years, it's really more than doubling to get to that 2% level. The consequence of which will be to make Japan, to give Japan the third largest military in the world after the United States and China, which is a clear signal to China and to North Korea that Japan appreciates that they're being threatened. And Japan has also announced a substantial purchase of Tomahawk cruise missiles, which have an effective range that could reach Beijing from Japanese territory and could cover the entire Korean peninsula. So it's a reflection of the concern in Japan about Chinese belligerence, its threats in the East China Sea, the threats to Taiwan, but really the threat all along China's periphery in the Indo-Pacific. And I think people want to see if, along with other cooperation in new cooperation in Asia, the Quad, Japan, India, Australia, the United States, AUKUS, the submarine deal with Australia, the United Kingdom, and the United States, that Japan is ready now to be what they have debated in Japan for 30 years, that they are now a normal nation. That's the term they use, and that a normal nation can help provide for its own self-defense. I think Japan has long since reached that point. I think it's very encouraging what Kishida said. So hopefully that will give an inspiration after the meeting with Biden to others in the region as well.
Just one question. Do you think that is there any room for cooperation between the US and China on global issues, for example, even on global issues?
Well, I think that's more up to the Chinese than anybody else. It's this: if you look at their long-term strategy, they're the ones that are trying to increase their military capability to wage economic warfare against other parts of the world. It's real. All of this is coming at their instigation. Countries in the region are reacting against it because they're very worried about what they see as a Chinese strategy to establish hegemony along their periphery in the Indo-Pacific, and then later on a worldwide basis. And it really does implicate Europe as well because of the close economic relations that Europe and the United States have with China. This could be a very difficult period ahead.
Ambassador Bolton, thanks for your time. I very appreciate your time.